First, I would like to welcome our speaker for tonight, Jane Guskin. She is the co-author of The Politics of Immigration, Questions and Answers, which I think there are some copies.
There's some copies up front.
Which was published in July 2007 by Monthly Review Press. Guskin is also a co-editor since 1990 of Weekly News Update on the Americas, a summary of Latin American news. In addition, Guskin edited Immigration News Briefs, a bulletin covering immigration-related news from 1998 through 2008. In 1997, Guskin helped found the Coalition for the Human Rights of Immigrants, an ally volunteer group mobilizing against workplace raids. From April 2002 to 2004, they worked to free their colleague and friend, Farouk Abdel Mouti, from immigration detention. Guskin is currently, I think, the co-director of the A.J. Muste Memorial Institute, a grassroots foundation supporting nonviolent action for social justice, and she's worked there since 1993. So please welcome me in joining Jane Guskin.
To stand up when I talk, so I'm just going to talk really briefly, and then I want to open it up to dialogue because that's really the most interesting part to me, because that's where I learn from you. So the first thing that I want to say is just that we're actually the co-author David Wilson of that book. We're actually currently working on revisions to that book. We're hoping to come out with a revised edition this year. So we really welcome any kind of feedback, any comments you have about the book. Really eager to hear that going into the revised edition, and we're just updating all the sources in it since it came out in 2007. So that's the sort of next project on the horizon. We're also hoping to put out a Spanish language edition of it once we do the revised edition. So because of what's going on politically around immigration right now, I thought that probably people might be interested in talking about immigration reform, since that is kind of what's on the agenda. So I just wanted to go over really briefly the stuff that's floating around there, and then really open it up to what kinds of, talking about what kinds of barriers are in the way of accomplishing more comprehensive immigration reform than what is being put out there, and what kinds of things you are all hearing, what kinds of questions you have, but also things that you're hearing that need good answers, like let's say from your coworkers who might be saying, you know, well, why should we do this or that? And so we can kind of come up with answers together for that, because that's really what the book was designed for as well. But the information is always shifting and changing, and the questions are always framed slightly differently, so it's really useful to have a conversation about that. So I was doing a lot of reading on the train up here about all of the immigration reform proposals that are floating around, one of which is the AFL-CIO platform, or whatever it is that they've put out there. And so, I don't know, maybe I should start with the congressional one, but it's so lousy that I think I'm going to start with the AFL-CIO one, which is only slightly less lousy, actually, unfortunately. But so this is good, because it gives us kind of a starting point for, let's look at how we can push these things and make them better. So the AFL-CIO one basically is not that different from the congressional one. It's basically 5 points in no particular order here. Secure the border. Why? They don't really say that. I don't know why we're supposed to secure the border, but that's in there. Limit and improve guest worker programs. Not get rid of them, just limit them or improve them. I'm not quite sure how they expect to improve them. Let's see, legalization. Everybody's got legalization in there somehow or another, although we can talk about the obnoxious way that the congressional plan has it in there. Strengthen E-Verify, which is the system by which employers verify that the workers have legal documents. Strengthening that is in the AFL-CIO proposal. Like I said, it's not very pretty. From my perspective. And then, what was the last one? all this weird language around future flow, the future flow of immigrants, controlling the future flow by setting up some commission that will determine how many flowing things we want in which direction. So it's very vague and weird, but future flow. It kind of, makes you wonder, like, are we talking about goods or people here?
Right.
So
Setting up more quota systems even.
yeah, it's just, I don't know, it's, I guess, their way of addressing what happens after you legalize everyone who's here, which is an important question. That may not be the answer for it. So, and the difference, basically the difference with the congressional one is that the legalization thing is just so awful that it's basically impossible.
Mm-hmm.
So Congress wants this, basically wants no legalization, but they want to pretend like they're giving legalization. So you would have to jump through hoops that don't exist in order to get your legalization. There would have to be, somebody would have to verify that the border states would have to verify that we have achieved total border security in order for anybody to get any legalization. And all people who are waiting in line for documents would have to get their documents first before anybody could be legalized under the congressional plan. So it's beyond lousy. So the other plans that are out there that are worth looking at for better ideas are the youth, the dream activists, have basically sort of a three-pronged thing, which is legalization, broad, sweeping legalization, an end to deportation and enforcement, and incorporating lesbian, gay, same-sex partner unification into the plan. So right now, if you're legally married and your immigrant partner entered with a visa and overstayed, they can get legalized. But if you're a same-sex couple, even if you're legally married in states that allow that, federal government doesn't recognize your marriage, and so you can't legalize your partner. So they're making a real point. The youth are making a real point of keeping that point in. So I'm just going to write those down. What is it? So broad legalization and without, like, they want to make sure they're saying not extra hoops to jump through, not heavy fines, not, just legalize everybody. And then end deportation and enforcement, and LGBT inclusion. Sorry, I don't write very well. There, okay. And I actually meant to start out by saying, because not everybody knows this, the last time that there was a sweeping legalization, the amnesty, for those who don't know, was 1986, and that was for people who could prove that they had been continuously resident in the U.S. since 1982. So this is 31 years that there are people who have been here for 31 years who have not been able to legalize. And then since the early 90s, when they got rid of a clause called 245I, people who entered the country across the border without a visa have not been able to legalize at all, even if they marry a U.S. citizen. So that's the current situation. So that's why legalization is needed, and that's why all of these plans include some form of legalization, because I think it's kind of clear to everyone at this point that 31 years, you have people who have spent their whole lives here and who are, heading into middle age without documents. It's kind of ridiculous. Okay, so this is the youth. This is AFL-CIO. And then the ACLU actually has a really good platform. I was really kind of surprised by that. They have a bunch of really comprehensive principles that includes, in addition to all the good stuff that's here, so they basically have these 3 points, as well as an end to racial profiling. which they make a really big point of. So that, I think, is really important, that people are talking about an end to racial profiling and including it in an immigration reform plan, which this is the first that I've heard talked about. It's actually, racial profiling is actually mentioned in the congressional plan. In one place it's mentioned, but it's mentioned as kind of, we should keep tabs on the racial profiling as we increase the border enforcement.
Like Arizona?
Exactly. No, that's exactly the context that it's in. It's in like the border enforcement stuff in Arizona. We should step up the border enforcement, but we should be careful about that racial profiling problem. So,
Careful.
it doesn't actually say anything useful, but it's interesting that even in the congressional plan, they mention the words racial profiling. The ACLU also calls on limiting detention. I think we could go farther and just say no detention, but they do call for limiting it, and basically limiting it by saying that people should only be detained if a judge determines that there are lots of reasons why they should be detained, like they're a threat to society or something. Right now, people are detained just because that's the way the system works and because the companies that profit from detention make a lot of money off it, so it's set up to throw everybody into the detention system. And they specifically talk about that profit motive and sort of limiting detention, and they talk about the way that that feeds into the whole incarceration culture that we have in this country and the profit motive in that. And then they say, this is basic, no E-Verify. That's the other thing that they have. No E-Verify. So that is one important way that it differs from the AFL-CIO, is that they say no E-Verify. And then there's something called the Dignity Plan. David Bacon wrote about this. I don't know how many of you have read David Bacon's excellent op-eds about immigration and labor. He does a lot of great work around this. And this is done by a coalition of grassroots immigrant rights groups. So they have an additional point in there, which I think is really important, which is, I'm just going to slide it in here. Their point is renegotiating trade agreements. So,
now that's not ACLU, that's
no, this is not the AFL-CIO. However, the AFL-CIO, this was interesting.
No, ACLU.
Oh, no, it's not the ACLU. The ACLU didn't include anything.
It's just Bacon.
It's just the Bacon.
No, well, this is Planned Dignity. So it's a coalition, a grassroots coalition of immigrant rights groups, basically, and some labor groups. Yep. But yeah, not the ACLU or the AFL-CIO. However, the AFL-CIO in their document, textually they talk about the importance of economic justice, global economic justice, and renegotiating trade agreements. They talk about all that stuff, and then for some reason they totally leave it out of their 5 points. So it's a little weird. It's like they bring up this important thing, and then they just don't actually say that we should be asking for it. I think they just felt like they had to say it. And then the Dignity Plan, basically also no enforcement and a broad legalization. So those are basically sort of the same as the youth plan. They do not, however, include the LGBT issue in here. Not sure why, but they don't. So if you were to take all of the good stuff from all of these, then you take legalization, you take all these three, you take this, limiting detention, no E-Verify, and renegotiating trade agreements. You put it all together and you have a nice plan. So the question is, how do we get there?
How do you get the ACLU to adopt these things?
Exactly. How do we get there? So I actually don't have the answer to that, but I think hopefully together we can figure out some answers to that. So I would like to open it up to questions in terms of what kinds of challenges do people think we face, and how can we come up with responses to those challenges? How can we address those challenges? So,
for clarification though, before we start, for the youth groups and the dream, and the ACLU plans and is it just a mission that they didn't name these other things? I mean, the other, no E-Verify, is that just a mission on the part of the youth groups, or is there a reason that they are?
Okay, that's a good question. I don't think that the youth groups are, they're just not as focused on the sort of global economic trade and labor kind of issues. You know, they're coming from a different place with it, and they're just not as focused on that. They're not as focused.
So conceivably, there's not a contradiction there.
There's no contradiction. There's no reason why they would be against it.
Right.
They just, they're coming from where they're coming from.
Right.
And they haven't, they just haven't really focused on those issues. I mean, most of them were brought here when they were kids, so the push factors, that their parents dealt with are not really, I mean, they it's not that they don't think about them. They do think about them and they do understand them, but it's just not usually the first kind of priority in terms of their organizing. But I mean, I think that they're certainly, a lot of them, especially in New York State, the New York State Youth Leadership Council is great, and they have a great analysis, and they're very capable of, adapting and changing and learning. And this is not necessarily, they haven't necessarily come up with a platform of their own that I've seen. This was sort of the national youth Dream Activist platform, so it could be that in New York State, they'll come up with something better. And I mean, that's the question is, how do you move forward? You're not going to be able to get all of these groups to necessarily sign on to each thing, but how do you move forward? And the other thing is, people have this idea that we all have to get behind a particular legislation, but that's not necessarily the case, because we're not the ones who are sitting in Congress voting on this thing. So we don't really have to decide whether we support a particular bill or not. What we have to decide is how we push the whole program farther and make it better, and how we come up with the strength to do that. So,
how about I'm going to take a stab at it. How do we build the coalition model? How do we get a buy-in? Naive as I am, from the AFL-CIO to go with more of a coalition model where we can, do more of a, what do you call that in the marketing? Stuff is where you have a tenant you believe in, but you don't necessarily believe in the two positions. Billy, do you remember what it's called?
Collaboration.
From years ago, the organizing model where you go to the table and you don't have a position you take.
Win-win.
Something bargaining, whatever. It's a model.
Bargaining.
Thank you, interest bargaining.
Yeah.
So how can we get the AFL-CIO to buy in more towards an interest bargaining stance so that they will get the pieces they want to get, and their partners in the community will get there. So I'm just throwing that out as we got to look at it from that standpoint. What things can we do as communities to move them in that direction where they might be more open to it?
right, and I think that, people here may have answers to that, but I want to point out another thing that you just reminded me of. That one thing I think that's really important is that the AFL-CIO is actually pushing immigration reform, and that is important. Yeah. That is important. Even if their plan sucks, it's still important that they're sending around this thing, urging the central labor councils locally and regionally to pass their own resolutions. So that also gives you an opening to pass a much more radical resolution locally than what the AFL-CIO is telling you should pass. So if you can get, so you can work on the local level, and if enough local central labor councils push something that's more radical, that will theoretically push the AFL-CIO in that direction. But I mean, it also creates a statement of its own. Even if they don't listen, it still has an impact.
And it may have a better impact because maybe more people are non-unionized at the moment and may buy into it.
Right. But you were going to say something?
I just want, with no E-Verify, no detention, no secure borders, and it just sounds like a single labor market. I mean, why wouldn't wages in any number of fields go straight down to the bottom? And I can't imagine the AFL-CIO headed towards that. When you look at all the dairy farms around here are run primarily by folks from not run, but the workers are from Mexico and Central America, and I can't imagine why labor would buy into that. Rather than having to move, they can just pay the rock bottom, more industries here.
But why would E-Verify make wages go up? I mean, it's basically, E-Verify is status quo right now. It's not making wages go up,
But
right? I mean, since the employer sanctions, which were brought in with the 1986 law, at the same time the amnesty was brought in, that has forced wages down, and that's what's created this system of disenfranchised workers, workers who have no rights. Basically what you need is you need a system where everybody has rights. And E-Verify does not contribute to that system. E-Verify just enforces that distinction.
right, but having a single market of all that labor, and essentially, you know, wouldn't it be bringing more competition? You know, more and more labor is willing to work for less.
Why would it bring more labor?
More possibility, more opportunity. I mean, that for the same reason it's been brought in the industries where they are now.
So you think that if there were no E-Verify, more workers would come here from other countries?
If there were more, presumably, all of these things that are happening now, detention, difficult border, is designed, you know, not very effectively, not at all humanely, to prevent that.
It's theoretically designed to prevent that. What it's actually designed to do is it's actually designed to keep workers afraid
Right.
and to make it harder for them to organize.
And allow
Yeah.
employers to pay less money.
Exactly. So it actually causes the problems that it's theoretically designed to prevent. I can see that you're not convinced, but we'll get back to that. We'll get back to that conversation because I think that it is a little more complicated than that. It is a complicated question.
So I mean, I think that what you just said sort of cued in clearly to me that this problem is really one of a kind of deep alliance between capital and the state.
Mm-hmm.
The question then becomes, right, like, and I think the danger is that because this is a juridical issue, and it's a labor law, it's a legal issue is maybe the broadest way to capture it, it then compels us to push as we might towards, you know, reforms of some sort, and the big worry I have is that when I teach at a university, students don't have the most robust picture of the news if they even know the news, and right, it seems that these sort of nominal panaceas can do a whole lot to take the wind out of people's sails, right? So the question becomes, you know, if the AFL is willing to jump on board with some pretty fluffy legislation, it seems like there's something going on there with thinking about how the status quo in general and ways of daily life have made us complicit with a kind of reactionary position, right?
Yeah.
So I don't really know how, that's not an answer, but that's definitely a problem that we've got to kick down the road a little bit before we get an answer.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that, or we have to kick it down the road while we're fighting for whatever we can get, because the reality is, you know, somewhere between 12 and 20 million people are without status and basically without rights in this country, so that's a problem that needs to be addressed. That doesn't mean that, I mean, there's all these other related problems, like, for example, the push factors. You have to deal with the global economic situation. You have to deal with why are, you know, addressing, and again, this is mentioned sort of in the AFL-CIO thing, but then not in their principles, is the things that this government has done that have caused the push factors in other countries. So promoting economic programs in other countries that have been disastrous, not only NAFTA and other trade agreements, but other types of structural adjustment and all that kind of stuff. So that conversation has to happen. Is all of that stuff necessarily going to get into a comprehensive immigration reform proposal? No, but I mean, I'm actually encouraged by the fact that it's actually mentioned in some of it already. So I mean, that's something, that's like a start. The other thing I just wanted to say that I thought was interesting, if a little, I guess not surprising, in the AFL-CIO thing, they make a big thing about how this is a, what do they call it? A shared prosperity agenda. So this is about pretending like the interests of big business are allied with the interests of labor. That was what I got out of it. I'm not sure if that's what they meant, but I suspect that's what they meant. And there's kind of a problem there, you know, because because they're kind of not really the same interests, and so
Well,
they're
like
trying.
They're taking the E-Verify position, to me, is a prime example of that, because the E-Verify should be something to put the businesses on notice and force them to be doing the right thing. But why is the AFL-CIO buying into that is a question I have.
And there's another piece to that, which I think is really important, which I forgot to mention before, also mentioned in the text of the AFL-CIO thing, but not in their 5 points. Who knows why? The need for greater labor enforcement, so enforcement of labor laws, enforcement of health and safety. They didn't necessarily spell all this out. This is my extrapolating it, but enforcement of health and safety laws, you know, we all know that there's maybe like a handful of OSHA enforcers for the whole country, you know, there's tons of workplace deaths and all of this stuff, right? So, you know, people being underpaid and all of this stuff, there's no money for enforcement in that. So if you want to talk about the getting rid of all these enforcement, you know, border enforcement and detention and deportation, then you can frame it in, let's shift all that money to labor enforcement, then we're talking about something that's going to push wages up. And then you're talking about a way of presenting it. They're not necessarily, you know, you don't have to do one to do the other, but, you know, it's a way to frame it, to shift it away from just the not enforcing one side, say there's other stuff that we should be enforcing that we're not enforcing.
Can you clarify how E-Verify works? What E-Verify?
It's basically a federal database where an employer who is participating in E-Verify has to run every new hire through this database and have them check to make sure that they're legitimately allowed to work person. So they either have a valid work permit or they're a U.S. citizen or whatever. Apparently it's also plagued with errors. The system is, you know, it's I don't remember what the percentage was, but it has a very high rate of incorrect results. So it doesn't work very well.
Would all employers be mandated to do that, or just some?
That depends on what they end up passing. But I mean, what the AFL-CIO is saying that everyone should be forced to use it, absolutely, with no exceptions, and it should be, you know, very serious penalties on any employer who doesn't use it. So they're putting it out there as if it's a tool to protect. I mean, you know, what they're saying is to protect U.S. workers, but I mean, immigrant workers are U.S. workers. Workers are workers. It doesn't matter whether they were born here or not. They are workers in the U.S., and they all need the same protections, and that's not protecting anyone. It's not, I mean, it doesn't say anything about paying them fairly. It's just about whether they have a document from the federal government that says they're here legally. It doesn't have anything to do with fair
If they put it in place, they would have to do it now on all their workers, and anybody they found didn't qualify, they would have to
presumably
let go.
Presumably. I mean, a lot of people use it anyway. The system exists, and employers, some states have passed things that say that all employers in this state have to use it, and some employers use it voluntarily. Yeah, I mean, a lot of, it's there. It's just, it would be more enforced, I guess, under the AFL-CIO. I just want to put in the whole thing about enforcing, I'm just going to say enforcing labor law, but labor law and health and safety, because I think that's a really important thing to include.
Yeah, just a way of looking at something, thinking as an anti-war-activist. If these reactionaries in this country want to ship people out of this country who aren't here legally, we should be even-handed about it. So U.S. citizens should be shipped out of other countries we're in. We should start with the fact that we have hundreds of thousands of military people in 120 countries. After that, we should go into the corporations, U.S. corporations. With this whole globalization thing, so much capital is going all over the the world and start sending them back. And I think it would be great also, if when you talk about labor laws, you start saying, well, you know, perhaps we shouldn't allow goods to come into the country that are done with sweatshop labor, that are where the labor laws are not protected. And we should put that kind of dialogue into these discussions on immigration rights. And I also think it would be really good if the immigrant rights movement in general would talk more about things like NAFTA and CAFTA and these globalization laws, because what they've done is they've destroyed the farms and the economies because they've had to compete on an even basis with subsidized farms here, and they've caused people to go into the cities and no place to go, but some of them come over here. And if we did that, I think we can make a better connection with some of the labor rights people. And I was encouraged last May 1st when a lot of us went down, we had a bus to go to the immigrant rights rally in New York City, that rally actually marched to a second rally that was organized by the labor movement. It was the first time they could come together. And I think if we thought in terms of immigrant rights as also labor rights, and put these things together, we'd have a better chance of building that kind of coalition, because it affects all of us, you know, in terms of these things. So I think we need to think in terms of framing it a little bit different sometimes.
Definitely, and I think those were very excellent points there. The issue of that the U.S. is sending people all over the world to places where they're not necessarily welcome, and also this banning the entry of sweatshop-made products. I think that's something that should be talked about. I'm not saying it's really going to happen, but it's just, like you said, it's how you frame it. You're saying, you know, if we're going to say that people can't come here to work for substandard wages, then why can't we say we shouldn't have goods come in here that were made with substandard wages? I mean, that would shift the whole question, right? I mean, then if we're no longer going to get stuff that's made in sweatshops in China and wherever, then that would mean what? They have to raise their wages and their working standards everywhere else in the world for us to buy their product. I mean,
or
I think it's
goods here, which something.
Or something. I mean, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I think just even raising the question shifts the whole dynamic. I mean, we had. It reminds me, we did these kinds of, David, the co-author, and I did these kinds of dialogues in a lot of different places, and we did one in Suffolk County Community College in Long Island, in a very sort of right-wing anti-immigrant community there. But, you know, these are mostly, you know, working class kids putting themselves through college, a mix of white and other, you know, non-white people in this classroom, and they were mostly, I think they were studying criminal justice, actually. But it was an interesting mix in the classroom, and, you know, they asked some really good questions, and one of the things that somebody said was, you know, well, don't they send all of, you know, don't immigrants send all of their money back to their countries? And so then we asked the question, when you spend your money in your community, is it actually going to your community? Or are you buying goods made in China, or, you know, whatever? So that's, it's a question that people have this particular way of framing it, and if you can shift that framework and get people to see it from a different perspective. So I think that's a brilliant piece to throw into it in terms of framing it. And I've never heard anybody else sort of suggest that, so I think that was useful.
So, Labor's been too quiet about this issue, and when they do have something to say, it comes out sounding like the AFL's kind of mushy plan that we were talking about. And as our friend in the front pointed out, you know, what makes that really disturbing is the fact that, you know, the status quo is some ugly combination of corporate and state interests, right? So, with Labor's plan being so close to the congressional plan, and if we can sort of assume that the congressional plan is in some way akin to big business's plan, I'm just wondering if any of the big business groups, if you're aware of coming out with some sort of platform, like the Chambers of Commerce or the National Association of Manufacturers, Ranchers Association, etc.
I haven't heard of anybody coming out with their own plan. I mean, I think by the way that they're presenting this bipartisan Senate plan, I think the implication is, since they've gotten the Republican Party behind it, that they've gotten big business behind it. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party what piece of big business is not included in that, I'm not sure. It's kind of covers it all. So I think their interests are pretty much taken care of in it, and I haven't heard of them. I mean, you have entities like, the Wall Street Journal or, Forbes or some of these things will come out with like a more open borders thing in the sort of libertarian sense of like the free flow of labor that we can control and manipulate as we please all over the world. So that's a slightly different take on it, but I think that in general most of the big business in the US is probably behind the bipartisan Senate plan. That would be my guess. So,
not meaning to drag out E-Verify, but that seems to be one of the things that most people in the general public don't understand. What's the big problem with E-Verify? You know what I'm saying? With E-Verify, they look at it like, what's the big deal? It's kind of like they don't understand, why people. What's the big deal with asking people for a picture ID to vote? So
right.
I find that that's a difficult one.
How do you address that?
Yeah, it is.
People, yeah.
I know we've been talking about it quite a bit, but and I think the reason is that this is a big deal. This E-Verify business. It's a pretty sneaky thing,
Would I be wrong in saying, because just on picking up on that, I'm sitting thinking about it. Now the corporate class has a great reason not to want E-Verify either, because, they want that labor.
Yeah.
Right.
And they want
So they have, so I'm sitting listening to, and some of these reforms can also be very right-wing. And, to say no E-Verify because I need these people for my meat packing plant, and
Right.
I don't want to be limited in how low I can pay wages and how, so there's kind of a right-wing side to these things also.
There can be, right, although the people who are calling for no E-Verify are not the corporate sector is not calling for an end to E-Verify.
Progressives. Usually.
The only people who are calling for it is the the ACLU
Right.
were the only ones really well, and the dignity plan also sort of calls for
But you
an end
said
to
the
enforcement,
AFL-CIO is asking to strengthen
yes, to strengthen it, yes.
And so I'm saying to myself,
Right.
is that putting them on a, labor side as opposed to, in other words, hire our union white members and not.
Right, no, that's exactly what they're
Right.
saying, and that's why they're saying to protect US workers. That's what they mean by that,
Which I'm thinking,
Right.
well, now the corporate class has a reason to be
Right.
aggrieved by that.
Right, and also, I was actually just reading a thing about Arizona and how in Arizona they passed like a really rigid thing about any employer caught even accidentally hiring somebody who was undocumented would have their business eliminated, basically, their business license revoked. And apparently they were saying that has cost Arizona, this was a Forbes article, right? It was saying the cost of the Arizona plan has been that businesses have fled or not set up in Arizona because they're like, look, if we make a mistake, then we're going to get our business license revoked. We just don't want to take that risk. Right. So yeah, sure, you could have businesses are not going to love E-Verify, but they're also not going to speak out publicly that much against it. But also, it's the question. The question is not. I think the problem is that people are saying, well, yeah, of course, we don't want to protect employers who are trying to push down wages by hiring undocumented workers. The point is, we just shouldn't have a system where we have two tiers of workers, where we have workers who have rights and workers who don't have rights. As long as we have that system, it doesn't matter whether you have E-Verify or you don't have E-Verify, people are going to find a way around it. One of the main ways that they find around it is that they just do contract labor. They just contract with a hiring company, and the hiring company takes the risk. If the hiring company loses their business license, they just form another one overnight and hire the same people back. That's the way it's been done for years. That's the way Walmart was hiring their cleaners. They just hire a cleaning company, and the company contracts out with the workers. They can go pick up day laborers off the street, and I don't even have to ask them for their names, and it's all legal.
the other point is laws don't have to be enforced. Those of us in the labor movement know that labor laws are not enforced. They simply are not.
Exactly.
And yet having a law like that on the book keeps workers worried, you know, that they can't protest what they're doing at work. They can't form a union. They can't do anything because they could be kicked out. You know, and it's like, you know, there's all sorts of laws that are being passed now that so far haven't been really pushed, like laws that you could pick people up without charges, you could put them in jail without charges, things like this that they're on the books, but they're not being used, but that they cause a kind of fear and so forth. And this is just another way to push on that, and it really, for the employer, ensures that there will be this cheap labor and there will be no pushback. And if there's no pushback from immigrant workers, there'll be less pushback from non-immigrant workers. So it helps them on many different levels, I think.
Good question, John.
Well, yeah, just on the E-Verify question, employers, you know, they may be inconvenienced by laws like that, but they also appreciate the benefit of the terror that it puts into workers for not organizing. And it's analogous to people say, well, single-payer health care, why don't employers want that? You know, they'll take a burden off of them. But what they do like is people fearing to lose their health care and therefore not making a fuss about getting a better situation with their health insurance. So, you know, that's that dual side of the corporate interest. And I'm a little wary about the whole question of goods and sweatshops. I mean, it's pretty easy to slip into economic nationalism on those things. That concerns me a little bit. And it will be interesting to see if, you know, somehow some alternative labor program could be put forward to what the AFL-CIO is proposing. But I think the bottom line for workers is you have to be able to explain why, you know, a open border labor situation with no discrimination against immigrants would be in the interest of everybody. Because on the surface it appears to most white native workers that, oh, you know, that's Mexicans undercutting us again, and so on. And you have to understand that they have to understand that they would be better off actually if these workers could organize and equalize wages and bring up the bottom. We have to bring up the bottom. That's the problem with the working class and labor in the United States today. The bottom is sinking and dragging everything down.
And that's true globally as well. So
Right.
wages are getting pushed down all over, and then that also creates more of a push for people to come here, but it also just depresses wages everywhere. But yeah, I mean, I think I understand what you're saying about the nationalism thing, except that I think in this case you're not talking about buy US. What you're talking about is banning goods that are not produced with a certain labor standard. And I'm not saying that it's even something that would necessarily get approved, but I think just bringing it into the conversation puts a twist on the whole issue of banning labor coming in. You say, well, why not ban goods produced with unfair labor instead of banning labor? So I think it's an interesting twist.
I guess one thing I'm thinking about is that some of the strongest coalitions, like early 20th century, for example, have been multiracial. And maybe this is just a question to clarify my own ignorance, but when I hear about the immigration rights movement, I tend to hear about that consisting of like people from Central America, Mexico. Once in a while there will be like a story where, you know, the partner of a same-sex couple from Australia or something was deported, but that's pretty rare. And I'm curious whether maybe you're aware of some coalitions that have reached out to different types of immigrants across like race and class lines, you know, because for example, you know, there are like Eastern European au pairs and students who have overstayed their visas and, you know,
come here to work over the summer, and now work in the strip bars and the pizza shops in Albany, and at least in my knowledge of what's going on, I don't see like those coalitions being like happening, even though a lot of the issues are are the same. So I don't know, maybe you could speak a little bit more to that.
I mean, I think it happens to a certain extent, but I think you're right. In general, it doesn't happen that much. I think part of it is just a question of numbers. There's a lot more undocumented immigrants from Latin America. People from Eastern Europe are more likely to have come here on a visa, which means that they have more options for legalizing. People who came across the border have no options for legalizing right now. Even marrying a U.S. citizen, they can't legalize. So that's created this mass of people, and also just the proximity, because it's so close. You have a lot of people who've come from Mexico or Central America or South America, but particularly Mexico, and so the numbers are just larger. So they're going to dominate any coalition. And then, of course, there's always issues. Coalition building is the most difficult thing that anybody could ever try to do. So if there's if it seems like there's more of one particular community, then other communities don't necessarily feel as welcome in it, because then they're a minority. But I mean, I did coalition organizing in New York City, immigrant rights movement in New York City for a few years, and we did the Mayday stuff, and we always brought in, as much as we could, we brought in other communities, but they're just, they weren't as active as the Latino immigrants in it, and the numbers were just not as strong. But I think it is partly because they do have other options, and also because the people who face the most discrimination in terms of being profiled as undocumented immigrants are Latino immigrants, or people who look like Latino immigrants, whatever that means. And so, European immigrants can pass, basically, and so they do. And so they're not going to be as likely to want to go out there and say, hey, we want our rights. They're just going to find their way to kind of slide through and pass. So
it may be a misperception on my part, but is it also our immigration policies that may create that situation? Because certain countries, we allow more immigrants to come from, and others have to go through longer periods of time in order to come in, and more hurdles. So I'm just wondering if maybe that plays into it a little bit too. Because we really don't want to allow, our neighbors to come across the border, so we make it very hard for them to come. Our southern neighbors to come,
well, I mean, the people who need to get visas and the people who need to get visas and can, and then the people who need to get visas but can't.
Right.
So there's three categories. I mean, there's the people who are part of the visa waiver program. All the Western European countries, they don't even need a visa. They just come here, and if they want to overstay, they overstay. And who's going to know and who's going to care? Nobody's going to ask them any questions. Right. But but if you're in Mexico, it's really, really hard to get a visa. You have to own property. You have to have a good job that shows that you have to do all of these things to prove that you're going to go back to your country. And even then, half the time, or more than half the time, even if you fulfill all of that criteria, they deny you. And you lose your $250 or whatever it is that you have to pay for your interview. It might be more than that now. It's a lot of money.
Two areas I just wanted to comment on and ask a question. One, I think that family and reunification, keeping families together, is something that appeals to a wide segment of society on the right and the left. But I think that part of any program really needs to center in on that. And second, the question is, different faith groups, particularly the Catholic Church, are really pushing for immigration reform. And are you familiar with what's going on with the Catholic Church or other faith groups in terms of this legislation they're discussing?
Yeah, I mean, the Catholic Church has been behind, push for legalization, and particularly on the whole family unity thing. They're obviously not going to go with the LGBT part of it, which is, I think, one of the reasons like a group like New York Immigration Coalition isn't going to go for it, because they have a lot of members in their coalition who are Catholic organizations. Yeah, I mean, and actually I was smiling when you were talking about the family reunification, because of course all of these things they all mention family reunification, and different concepts of what family is, but also the AFL-CIO one had this bizarre thing about all the reasons why family reunification is important, because apparently if you're in the labor movement you wouldn't understand why family reunification is important. And one of these things is that the family is an important economic unit.
Okay. Yeah, the kids will make you buy everything.
So yeah, I guess they felt like they had to explain that for some reason, but so that was kind of cracked me up. But yeah, I mean, family reunification is like a big, way of presenting the broader legalization thing. So.
I mean, it strikes me too that one way to think about more coalitional stuff, and this is totally stealing a play from my better half's book, but the new Jim Crow, there's a big focus now on the prison industrial complex, and this is focused in. And I think we have to be clear that this, it seems to me, in all of the kind of tricky issues we're running into, is this needs to be a resolutely anti-capitalist movement. I mean, there's no possible way for this to work unless that kind of radicalism comes back to the labor movement, comes back to these sorts of movements, because it seems like in all of these cases that function of accumulation is what's at work. So now it's very convenient to do this because our wages have been depressed really far and labor's in a weak spot, and so we can let this happen now, but it seems like that active side of things needs to be there, especially if we're not going to be kind of duped by quick fixes and kind of bad legislation. And so I think the new Jim Crow is one place where that kind of radicalism is really happening right now, and it's young and it's angry and it's totally connected. So
yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I think it was really important that there were issues, especially in the ACLU platform. They talk about the prison industrial complex. They talk about mass incarceration as a serious problem that this country is facing. They talk about the racial profiling issues, so they bring all those things into it. I think that's really a crucial point, because every time I do these dialogues, it's like at some point the conversation always ends up talking about the criminal justice system and the injustice of it and racial profiling. It's like you can't talk about immigration in this country and not talk about racism. You just can't. So if you're not dealing with racism, then you're not dealing with the issue. Right. So I think that the tricky part is, so you have a sort of expedient situation. So you've got the fact that Congress is looking at this thing, that all these different groups and coalitions are all addressing this. We have a window of opportunity to push something, and we don't want to push the stuff that's bad, but there needs to be some kind of unity and some kind of strength in unity. So you can't just say, well, none of this is good enough because we need, anti-capitalist revolution. Because then you're going to miss that window of opportunity, and you're not going to have people. You're not going to have people who are. I mean, if we can get 12 to 20 million people legalized, then we can push things farther. So it's like take those crumbs and run with them. But that doesn't mean, and this is one of the biggest problems that we've had in the past, demanding crumbs. You have groups that come out there and they say, well, we don't want to ask for X, Y, and Z because we know they're not going to give us that. So we'll ask for what we think they're going to give us. That's just the craziest thing, because you wouldn't do that. Like if you're in a labor union, you're going into negotiations, you don't ask for what you think they're going to give you. You don't say, well, we're going to ask for $5 an hour because that's what we think they want to pay us. You go in there with everything you've got. You ask for what you want, and then they're going to chip away at it, and you're going to get whatever you have the power to get. But it's not our role to chip away at what we want before we even ask for it. So the question is, how do you, as people engaged in the political sphere, how do you push right now in a way that is strong and unified and still be true to what's really important, so not be chipping away at your demands? So how do you create the unity and the strength without selling out half of what you want? So I think that's really the crucial question. Oh, sorry, him and then you.
Don't depend on the AFL-CIO. I'm absolutely serious. I've been involved with them for 30 years. They're not an advocacy group. They're affiliation of groups, very undemocratic, that basically live by the blackboard. And what their positions are, without even researching it, I'm willing to guess that they've come up with what they think may pass and what they realize none of their larger groups will complain about. And if you go back to the healthcare debacle of Obama's first term, the AFL-CIO had a wonderful set of, I went around teaching this for the forum. They had this wonderful set of principles that sounded nice and like background papers like you're talking about. But as time went on, there's 7 principles. Well, by the time they were finished, they had about 1.5 left. And that's what they're going to do again.
Well, they started out.
But I guess, you know, like, why they want e-verification because the building trades are very anti-immigrant. Okay? And you can go through all of them.
Except for Irish.
And actually, well, that's an interesting thing, because the one group you were talking about in the city where you may get support would be in Woodside, where I grew up, where there was a lot of illegal Irish. I don't know if you ever tried going around there.
Yeah.
But that's kind of an aside.
Yeah.
That's a whole other. But yeah, the president of NOW, when during the healthcare thing, when she was complaining about the AFL-CIO, she's the one who said, you know, that NOW is an advocacy group. Advocacy groups push for what they believe is right. Labor unions don't, unfortunately. And like, we're next week try to improve their principles, but if you follow what happened with healthcare, we've actually got the AFL-CIO national to pass a resolution for single payer. But what they do is, whatever resolutions are passed that they don't like, they just ignore them.
Right.
So you really got to, I'd ignore them and go with a group like the ACLU or something to start with.
I mean, well, the bottom line too is that the AFL-CIO is weak. You know, I mean, they talk in their thing. They talk about, you know, like I said, it wasn't part of their points, but it was in the text about the need for a more labor enforcement, labor law enforcement. What have they accomplished toward that end in all these years? Right? Nothing. Have you ever even heard them demanding more labor enforcement? You know, I mean, theoretically they do, but they're not really doing. They don't have much clout.
Yeah.
They don't really have a lot of power. They don't have a lot of strength, and they're not pushing for these things. If they had been, maybe we'd be in a different situation. You know, if they had, you know, what percentage of the workforce is unionized?
11.3.
Thank you, 11.3.
6.6 in the private sector alone.
Right.
When you take into consideration the mid-50s, it was approximately 35% of the entire country, and none of the public sector was organized.
Wow.
That's massive.
Yeah.
If I could make a suggestion on these, to me, immigration, it's like a civil rights issue. And it's also an economic issue. And the other thing that these groups all of a sudden have decided has to go up is the minimum wage. But if you look at what they call the minimum wage, it's absolutely not a living wage. And I think we got to start pushing for a true living wage.
Sure.
Because if we had a true living wage here, now we could start pushing it, you know, globally. And you wouldn't have to worry about immigration. Because if you knew anyone could support their family, not as a unit, but as one person, you know, like in the old days when I was growing up, then we wouldn't have to worry about all these things as much.
Yeah, I'm just curious in terms of getting something going around the question that's more radical and militant. New York City, you live in New York City, and they historically have been a center in terms of immigrant rights organizing. What are they thinking about for Mayday this year? Do you have any sense of that at all?
I actually haven't even seen anything. I mean, I assume that there'll be a march. There always is, but, well, not always, but there has been since, I think we did the first big one, it was in 2000. But no, I haven't seen anything in particular about it this year, which is interesting because it's coming up in a few months. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I think it's, It's an important moment, and what happens is going to depend a lot on that grassroots energy, whether that grassroots energy really emerges. So if we get a movement like what we had in 2006,
Yeah.
then we can get everything we want and more. But if it's a sustained movement. So in 2006, we had from Valentine's Day to Mayday, millions of people across the country mobilized, walking out of factories in Kansas and Nebraska, walking out of meat packing plants, chicken processing places in Delaware. You know, we had just massive, you know, protests. We had protests of several thousand people in towns of 10,000 people in the middle of nowhere in southwest Kansas, all over the country. So just massive uprising. And at the end of that time, actually in mid-May of 2006, the Senate was desperately looking around for things to appease this movement, and they passed ag jobs, which was the agricultural worker thing. They passed the DREAM Act. They passed a bunch of stuff. It didn't matter because the House had passed the anti-immigrant bill, and then it all went to conference, and then they trashed it all. Didn't go anywhere. But you know, in the pressure of just that few months, with that level of mass mobilization, and that mass mobilization did not have a specific legislative demand. It was for legalization, but it didn't squabble about what we were going to call it. It didn't squabble about how it was going to be framed. It was just a movement. And so if that kind of energy can be generated again, you know, but nobody controlled that movement. Nobody directed that movement. Nobody snapped their fingers and made that movement happen.
Right.
It happened. It kind of came out of nowhere, and it kind of went to nowhere. So, you know, it's not like we can say, okay, let's do that again. I wish we could say that. But, yeah. I mean, I think the other part of it is, so if people do mobilize, even if they're small mobilizations, I think it's totally crucial to go out there and support, and to, you know, you bring your signs for whatever your thing is. So even if the people organizing it have demands that are less than what you want, you come and support, and you build that strength and power, and you diversify the demands while increasing the unity and the strength. So.
I was telling you earlier about how I was going to listen to these webinars that the AFL-CIO is doing weekly. And one of the things they mentioned in at least 2 of the webinars is that they're going to do multi-city tours. So I immediately, you know, reached back and said, oh, well, you know, there's like all these groups and individuals, and I'd like to connect all of them, et cetera. And then I got this pushback of, well, we're not exactly doing that, but Scott will get a hold of you. I don't know who Scott is. But it was this real, well, then what is this, okay? Well, we're only doing our members.
Oh.
I pose, based on your question about what's going on either in the city or whatever, I pose we should do something here, and we should make Mayday be a real people's celebration in that framework, because now is a good time to do that.
Absolutely.
And I think there's so many great groups in this neck of the woods that we could all come together and, you know, support each other in doing that. So I'm going to put that on the table.
Good idea.
What do you think the timeline is for the legislation in Washington? By Mayday?
I have no idea.
No.
I mean, you know.
No one knows anything about
No.
Congress.
For sure.
I mean,
It'd be great, but I don't think
Don't
so.
think so.
the other thing is, you know, what happens in the streets impacts on what happens in Congress. Whether they admit it or not, it impacts it. So that was the point of my example of 2006. Like, the Senate was not going to pass any of that stuff. The Senate wasn't even thinking about that. You know, 6 months earlier, the House had passed this totally anti-immigrant bill with all these intense enforcement stuff, and even if you ever met an undocumented immigrant, they were going to throw you in prison. You know, and then 6 months later, the Senate is like, oh, what can we pass that'll help immigrants? You know, it's like what happens in the street has a big impact. You know, and especially if there's power and energy coming from it, and some level of unity. And, you know, again, the trick is not to have the unity be around something that's too diluted, you know, to get that unity but still have the strength of the demands. And I think that's a challenge, but, you know, you just do what you can do, you know. just do what you can do. I'm sorry.
Could you talk a little bit about the dynamics between the mainstream immigrant rights groups and the grassroots? I mean, I understand that's been a big challenge.
I think it's always a challenge,
Yeah,
you know, it's like in any movement.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, sure, you have a lot of the mainstream groups where their leaders are really just like jostling for positions of power, especially, you know, under Obama. You know, you have Cecilia Munoz from National Council of La Raza, you know, using her organization to get herself into the administration, into a position there, and then basically just selling out, you know. I mean, they're not really the movement anyway. They can't sell out the movement because they're not the movement. They're just a policy group or whatever. They're already all, you know, I mean, it's just all those groups, they're out of touch. Number one, they're out of touch, you know. I mean, the New York Immigration Coalition, you know, for years they wouldn't even support legalization. When people, you know, we had 5,000 people on Mayday 2000, which was the first time that there had been an immigrant rights Mayday March in New York. The first time, 5,000 people in the streets, organized mostly by the Tepeyac Association, which was a church-based group. Just, you know, families, women with strollers, and, you know, just regular people. This was not like a leftist demonstration. And 5,000 people was a lot for that time. And, you know, the New York Immigration Coalition still, you know, it took years after that for them to actually come around and say, well, yeah, I guess we want legalization. Mm-hmm. They're so far behind the grassroots. I mean, the grassroots is where it's all happening, and the movements up there, you know, the policy groups and the mainstream groups, it's like they're just, they're playing catch up.
And they're the ones that are negotiating in Washington.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, the grassroots people are not in Washington, you know. I mean, well, no, I mean, to a certain extent they are. So that you see, for example, the Dream Activist kids, they're putting themselves out there all over the place, and they're totally not buying what the policy groups are saying. And they're actually really pissed off at the policy groups because the policy groups are trying to get them to do X, Y, and Z, and don't use this tactic and don't use that tactic. And they're like, screw you, we're going to sit in front of Schumer's office, we're going to do whatever we want, because we actually have, you know, issues that we want to resolve in order to have a future. You know, we're not, this is not just some policy issue to us, this is our lives, we don't care, you know, what you want to tell us to do. So they've really, they've pushed it. And of course, you know, it's like the leadership of these organizations is made very uncomfortable by any kind of power at the grassroots because they can't control it. You know, or in 2006, those mainstream groups were scrambling around to try to control this huge movement and to take credit for it. They couldn't. I mean, it totally caught them by surprise. They had no idea. You know, they had no control over it.
Does anybody have any idea where these quote-unquote 11 million, whatever, I think that's the latest I've heard, 11 million, I don't know what the right phrase is anymore. You know,
undocumented, out of status,
whatever,
without papers, whatever you want to do.
Poor workers are. Where are they working? I mean, does the Fortune 500 have a hand in this? Do they have a stake at all, or is it mostly small businesses? Or has anybody done the decent study on it?
No one's milking cows.
Yeah.
Not from Mexico, but anywhere around here. And it's amazing. I mean, and they are forced because of a lack of status. I mean, they're just hidden in so many ways and locked out of services that they need.
Is that what you've heard too, though? Is it small businesses, basically?
It's all across the board.
Yeah.
Everywhere.
Yeah, look, I mean, the Walmart.
Even big companies.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends, you know, because some companies are, there's a lot of companies that use a particular payroll service that does check Social Security numbers, so they're going to have fewer undocumented workers. It doesn't mean they're not going to have any, they're going to have fewer, because in order to get a job at those places, you need to get a valid Social Security number, which means somebody else's Social Security number. Those are more expensive than getting the cheap ones that you can get on Roosevelt Avenue in my neighborhood, which are just a made-up number. But those ones won't pass, you know, E-Verify, or they won't pass, even just like ADP, the payroll company, they run a Social Security number check on anyone that comes into their, you know, anyone who they do payroll for. So if you are trying to get a job and you're undocumented and you don't have a real social security number, you're not gonna be able to get a job with a company that uses ADP for their payroll. So I mean, I mean, and it also depends on where, like different areas, there's different things. So for example, in Chicago, all of the from what I understand, not all, but a lot of the factories and a lot of the industry there, including restaurants and everything, they hire through these labor companies, so these labor agencies.
Right.
So like temp agencies or
Manpower
whatever.
type?
Yeah, well, like just all these small labor agencies.
Fly by night, labor.
Fly by night, exactly. They can they can be shut down, they'll reopen the next day, the same
might be different
owners,
day.
you know, down the street or different, you know, whatever. So that's where almost everyone, you know, who's undocumented gets their jobs is through these labor agencies. That's what places you in a factory or places you in whatever. So they're taking responsibility for the, you know, for the hiring and for all that. And then the companies don't even have to deal with it.
One concrete example is in Vermont, at least in Burlington area, because I know people in culinary. This guy will come around and ask the restaurant owners, do you need dishwashing done? And they'll say, yes, because we go through dishwashers, like, you know, they come, they leave, they come, they leave. Take care of your dishes. So then they send these undocumented workers in to do the dishes. And they work right beside the regular staff who are getting paid. You're gonna get to know each other. And the regular staff doesn't know what to do about it because they know they're not getting paid overtime. And they're not. And it's pretty widespread. If it's widespread in Burlington,
It's widespread all over now.
home county, it's probably all over the place. And that's one way that you can really do it. You go. I mean, I run the company myself. No. but you get one guy just doing that, and who else is even filing any thing, because they pay cash. It's like, oh, $50 a week to get my dishes washed. Done, you know? So how do you enforce that? How do you track that? You know, so that's one concrete example of how you run that scam.
There was an interesting article, I don't know, a year or so ago maybe, in the Syracuse Peace Council newsletter. I think it was a professor who went undercover and he spoke Spanish and he didn't say a whole lot, and he went and worked for a labor contractor, and they got in these vans early in the morning, they took them to some factory, they took them to some some farm processing place, whatever, and they worked, and, you know, people would kind of whisper what was going on, and, you know, and they didn't even know where they were going.
Yeah.
And up in my town, there was a mason, I think this is still going on, who had, he had H-2A work, H-2B?
H-2A.
No, because they were working. They weren't farm workers. So
they did special visas, so they could only work for
high tech or the
and then they go home.
H2A.
They were just
H2B.
H2B probably. Yeah.
So it's the H1, or the high tech.
Yeah,
these are H-2B.
Yeah, so they were just from different places, but I live in a little tiny town.
They do it right here in Albany. Latham is a corner.
Yeah.
I know every morning you'll see a whole group of all Latino. Vans come by, pick up, they want 5 people, five people.
Day laborers.
Yeah.
Day laborers, you know.
Somebody in the back, did you have?
Oh, no, I was just gonna say, the more repressive the enforcement is along those border states, the more sort of pressure there has been for people to come into the sort of internal part of the country and get hidden and lost in these small cities where the racial profiling is a lot harder to do. You can't be spotted as an undocumented worker so easily when there's lots of other brown people around.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that's interesting about the border enforcement is this guy did a study. I'm sure there have been other studies as well, but this one where he studied the effect of the increased border enforcement, and he found that actually one of the things that it caused was a reorientation of migrants from Mexico to the U.S. So whereas before they still considered themselves to be living in Mexico and they would try to go back as much as they could, sort of the increased enforcement on the border basically forced them to basically say, well, I'm just going to have to stay here, so I'm going to bring my family here as well, since I'm not going back there anymore. So it actually increased migration here, and it decreased the mobility, which that's another interesting thing that somebody posted on the Facebook event invite was this article about mobility and the importance of mobility, and that was actually really interesting because that's rarely talked about, and you know, one of the things that pointed out is not everybody wants citizenship, and I think that's another component that you're never going to see in any of this stuff, and it gets into more complicated territory. But really, yeah, there are a lot of people who just want to be able to come and go, and they don't want to actually be rooted here, and that kind of gets into also the whole psychology of the immigrant experience, which is, I think, important to look at. And the fact is, when you migrate, you're no longer, you never really belong here, and you don't belong anymore where you came from. So you're in this kind of torn position. And really, my mother is an immigrant from England. She's been living in this country for 50 years, and she finally got citizenship because she goes back and spends 4 or 5 months a year in the UK, and then she would come back here and they'd say, you're spending too much time here, we're going to take your green card away. And so she finally got citizenship here. So she has 2 passports, and she comes and goes. Nobody, you know, because she's a, you know, white lady in her 70s, so nobody really questions her allegiance to one country or another. It doesn't ever become an issue. But in fact, you know, that's really, for an immigrant, often the only way to really be whole is to be able to go back and forth. It's, you're never really fully belonging in one place or another, and so if you can move back and forth, and the whole system is just set up to deny that, to question people's allegiance. You have to want to be a U.S. citizen, you have to renounce everything else, and you know, you can't want to.
No dual citizenship.
Right, I mean, they actually do allow dual citizenship, but they don't acknowledge it. And so, you know, in the citizenship swearing-in ceremony, you have to renounce all other citizenship, but that doesn't actually mean you have to give up your other passport. You know, there's lots and lots of dual and triple citizens around. It happens, it exists. Some countries are more tolerant of it than others. Some countries don't allow it. So for some countries, if you become a U.S. citizen, you lose your citizenship. Mexico has actually certain restrictions. There's certain things you can't do if you become a U.S. citizen. You don't lose your Mexican citizenship, but there are certain restrictions. So that's some reasons why people don't necessarily always want to be a citizen. But I mean, the other thing, I mean, I've had situations where, you know, like a friend who, you know, her partner was from another country, and so he wanted to, they lived there for a while, but then they wanted to come live here for a while. But it's like, if he's going to come live here for a while, then okay, then you have to go through this long process to get him residency, and they have to live here. It's not like you can just come here for 6 months and live, you know. No, you have, and you can't, in the meantime, he can't come as a visitor if he's married to a U.S. citizen or with a U.S. citizen, because then he's got family ties and he's planning to immigrate, and you don't get a visitor visa if you're planning to immigrate.
And how many visitors?
And what if, you know, aren't people allowed to just not be decided? You know, I mean, we don't even question, as Americans, we don't question our right to like go off to some other country for a few months and just check it out, you know, and then maybe fall in love and decide to move there or whatever. It's like we don't even question that right, and yet we deny that right to everybody else.
Well, American exceptionalism.
Exactly. But people just don't even think about it. They don't even think about the fact that we take that for granted, that we can go wherever we want, basically, and do whatever we want, and yet we're not allowing people to have that kind of uncertainty. A lot of people just want to come here to check it out, and they can't do that. They're denied a visitor visa just because, you know, oh, well, they might come to live, and like, so what? You know, they might, and they might not, and who cares if they do, you know? The main problem is having, you know, a whole group of people who has fewer rights. That's where you have the problem. It's not that, you know, we have too many people. We don't have too many people. That doesn't, you know, that's not the issue.
The one thing I wanted to mention was the building trades in the 1990s were absolutely astounded. They couldn't figure out how the hell it was going on, because there were so many, I mean, these like little drywallers, electricians, masons from Central America. It would suddenly just pop up and Chicago and San Francisco on these jobs. And you couldn't figure out what the hell was going on. It was a company that's been in business for years. It's called the Dodge Reports. And Dodge Reports company puts out these reports for all contractors and labor unions use them, and it tells you what the latest jobs are and who got the contract and when it's expected to start. So all these guys were doing in Central America was once the internet broke, they just subscribed to the Dodge Reports. They paid the $199, $200, you know what I mean? You know, big job coming up in Chicago. We're going to need drywallers. They showed up. It was unbelievable, and they were going back and forth as they pleased. The job ended. They went back to Central America, and they discovered these guys had laptops. They were hooked to the internet and everything. It's amazing, and they do this huge migration constantly, back and forth. I don't know how difficult it is now. Any more difficult? It was probably easier then, but
Yeah, in the 90s it was a little bit easier then, but it's quite risky. It's quite risky now. I mean, you're really kind of taking your life in your hands to travel. I mean, Mexico requires people from Central America to have a visa to the U.S. in order to get into Mexico. So basically, through the U.S. government pressuring Mexico, they've instituted this requirement, basically pushing the U.S. border south to the border between Mexico and Guatemala. So now immigrants from Central America have to go through this whole gauntlet of Mexico in order to get to the U.S., where in Mexico they're going to get robbed, they're going to get, and of course the police are one of the biggest culprits in this. I met a woman years ago from El Salvador who had come up with a group of women immigrants from El Salvador, and she told me that it took them several months to get through Mexico. It usually does take several months. So they were brought through in a group by one particular, trafficker or whatever, and the safe house where they stayed in Puebla State was the mansion of the head of immigration for Puebla State.
Oh.
That was their safe house. So the level of corruption in the system it's really on every level. But I mean, they go through this whole gauntlet. They get robbed all the time. There's actually a documentary I saw not long ago called La Bestia, the Beast, that's about the cargo train that Central American migrants take from the Guatemalan border up into the center of Mexico. And a lot of people get killed on it. There's like one particular stretch of it where every single person will be mugged and raped. Like all the women get raped. Like this guy he's a journalist who was a mainstream Spanish language journalist, and then he decided to make this movie, so he's doing more advocacy stuff now. But he said he was kind of shocked that he talked to women and found out that basically they all knew when they left on this journey that they were going to be raped, and a lot of them actually went on the pill because they knew that they were going to be raped and they didn't want to get pregnant. And I mean, and he rode the train and filmed on it, and that one particular stretch of it, he was like, it's too risky, I can't do it. So he got off and then went and got back on it later and interviewed them, and the people who were still on it had all been robbed and raped. And anybody who put up any kind of fight was killed and just thrown off the train. So I would say, it's a lot more difficult now to get from Central America here, which is why people are not going back and forth as much.
They were amazed at the talent and skills. These people were good, really good. Good drywallers, good ironworkers, good electricians, really good, sharp.
Sure. Is there another question?
Pat, you was
I wondered, the fairly naive question of why are there so many deportations now of family members and so on at this particular time, considering we're supposed to have changed our policy?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's a question that a lot of people are asking. That's a question some of the DREAM activists were asking too. I think Prerna is one of the DREAM activists who's been really active and written a bunch of stuff. She had a really good piece about it. She's like, okay, so if the administration is putting forward its legalization proposal, why is it at the same time doing these record deportations, like 450,000 people deported just in the last year? It's set a record every single year of the Obama administration has set a record of deportations over previous years. So why are they doing that? probably part of it is to put on pressure for legalization. That's actually been a sort of strategy of when there is an interest in passing some kind of legalization, they'll do a strategy of sort of putting pressure on people so that people will then try to, I don't know.
That doesn't make any
But no, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense, but I mean, why are they doing it? Because they can get away with it, and because there's profit to be made from it, basically.
Right.
I mean, those are the main things. There's profit to be made, and they're doing it because we're letting it happen.
And if that income stream is gonna slow down, they're gonna try to get it in under the wire, right? Like, it really is like binging before dieting. I'm gonna eat all this now, but tomorrow I'm done.
Did you have your hand up in the back, or?
No.
Yeah, well, I think one possible reason for the record deportations in the last 4 years is because the economy went down and they decided to just get rid of excess people hanging out in the streets. And at the same time, as I understand it, the Mexican economy has improved so that there's fewer young people wanting to, this takes a lot to have to do immigrate like that, even if it's relatively easy. People don't just pick up and move for no good reason. But the other observation I wanted to make, I was thinking when you were talking about the 2006 and how that just sort of erupted, and then I thought, well, that's sort of there's some similarities between 2006 and 2012, Occupy Wall Street, where all of a sudden young people erupted here in this country, and what was the government's reaction in both cases? Crackdown. I mean, the reason that not much happened after that 2006 eruption was because there was like a counter-revolution or a counter-attack by immigration authorities to, take their revenge for being that audacious. And the same thing happened with Occupy Wall Street. I mean, when there's popular mobilizations, there is a counterattack by reactionary forces. You have to expect it.
Though that's definitely true, and it is definitely true that was a part of why the 2006 protests sort of fizzled away, or sort of rapidly fizzled away. I don't know, that's not quite fizzling, I guess, when it's dramatic and rapid. But I think it wasn't the only reason. They stepped up the raids in April, right? There wasn't really much happening after May 1st, but they stepped up the raids. They continued to step up the raids, the workplace raids, and all kinds of enforcement on all different levels and detention and all that stuff. But there was also, the impression that I got, sort of being involved in the movement and also following it very closely. I wrote, I was putting out this thing, Immigration News Briefs, and I did this very detailed following of all of the different actions that happened all over the country. And the impression that I got was people felt like people in the immigrant community, the grassroots, the workers who were the base of this movement, workers and all kinds of people, but they felt like they had said what they needed to say and that they'd done their thing, they'd done their part. So it's not just that, yes, it's not like there wasn't enforcement before, but they overcame that fear in order to have those protests. But you can't walk off your job, every month for the rest of your life either. So they did this big, powerful push, and then they felt like, okay, we said what we're going to say, we put it out there, we're strong, we're powerful, now we're going to sit back and wait for somebody to respond and give us what we're asking for. And you can't do that. You have to sustain it. And with the Occupy movement, and there's still pieces of it that are doing stuff, but the sort of initial strength also dissipated. It's very hard to maintain momentum and strength in a movement. It's not easy, and especially if you have that intensity, that level of activity, you can't really keep that up as a movement unless you have, I suppose if you have like a mass movement of unemployed people, might be easier to keep it up because then they're unemployed and so they can make that their only activity. Otherwise people have lives they have to get back to, so it's hard. It's not easy. I think, it's one of the questions that we have to look into is how to sustain movements, how to make movements sustainable. And if more people are involved in them, then people don't have to maybe put, each person doesn't maybe have to put as much in.
So I know we've been going for like an hour and a half. I don't know how tired you are, if there's any other questions, but maybe any last, yeah?
I was going to ask you to comment about the use of drones on the Mexican border in relation to
Oh yeah, that part, you know, I didn't even get to read that part, but that's even in the congressional proposal. There's a thing for drones on the border. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, you know, yeah, and I totally forgot to read that part of it. But Prerna mentioned that too, the dream activist person. She's like, are they kidding? Like, what are they going to do? She said, I'm surprised they didn't propose building a moat with alligators in it along the border to like eat all the people who try to cross.
Have they put mines yet? Landmines?
I wouldn't be surprised if they would propose that as well. I mean, you know, obviously that kind of stuff is outrageous, but I mean, I think that they're gonna put in there whatever. I mean, again, there's profit to be made off that stuff. You know, there's money to be made off it, and you know they think they can get away with it. So, I mean, it's outrageous. Is that what you wanted me to say? It's outrageous.
you know, how it would impact all of the other things we were talking about, you know, about people coming here, about, you know, all the other issues.
It's just, yeah, I mean, it's just one, I don't think it's really, I don't think that in itself would have any actual, not have that much impact on the ground in terms of what, I mean, already there's so much that discourages people from coming, and they still come if they, you know, if they feel like they don't have a future where they are, they're gonna look for somewhere where they have a future, you know. So I don't think that it's gonna discourage people more than what's already happening is discouraging people. I mean, I think what discourages people is if the economy here is crap and their future doesn't look too bright here, then they're less likely to come here. You know, so we could make things crappier here, and then fewer people would want to come if that's our.
What are the stands of the other groups about that issue?
None of them mentioned it.
Oh.
Yeah, none of them mentioned it. That's why I totally forgot about it. The only one who mentioned it was the Dream Activist. I mean, not their plan, but their this one person, Prerna, mentioned it just in the context of, you know, this is kind of crazy and outrageous that they're proposing such things. But I mean, also, detention is crazy and outrageous, and people have accepted that. You know, people have just accepted that as normal, and it's outrageous. And even, I mean, the ACLU thing is pretty good on saying, you know, detention should be limited, but really, why should we have detention at all? We don't have civil detention for anything else.
These
you
are
know.
not crimes.
They got rid of debtor's prison. You know, there shouldn't be civil detention. Huh?
That's back.
Did they bring it back? Really? Oh
well,
my God.
especially in the South, there are a lot of people serving time for
Wow.
child support and other civil.
But not paying the rent.
Huh. Well, so there you go. It's happening because we're letting it happen and not pushing back. But again, I mean, the reason why immigration detention is happening is because there's so much money to be made from it. You know, so there's these powerful interests that they go and they lobby for these laws. And I mean, it's not even just, I mean, yeah, so there's certain things, there's mandatory detention, but the government actually has a lot of choice on whether to detain people or not. So they don't actually have to detain people, even though the law in some cases mandates detention. And there's just no reason not to just abolish detention. There's just no reason for immigration detention to exist. And so I think that even just calling to limit it, I think we can go farther than that. I think we can just call to end it, because it certainly doesn't serve anyone except the companies that are making money off it and their shareholders.
Is it all privatized?
It's not all the detention facilities are run by private companies, if that's what you're asking. Yeah. Some of them are run by private companies and some of them are run by the federal government, and a lot of them, the federal government rents bed space in county jails and in other facilities, particularly county jails.
Yeah, especially in the South, there are county jails in where the county has 10 or 20,000 people, and it's a tiny little jail, and they've floated bonds, built huge $1 million jails, and they're it's a significant amount of income for the county, the money from
It's a moneymaker.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's under
it's-
Bush it was, now Obama deports people a lot faster than Bush did, but that was these tiny rural counties, no one speaks Spanish. And people used to wait in there 12 to 18 months
Yeah.
in Alabama County Jail.
Yeah. Yeah, in Louisiana, there was
No
a big,
staff, just couldn't-
there was a big thing too, because they were all shipped from all over, everywhere else in the country, so shipped thousands of miles from their lawyers and from their families with no option to visit, so, yeah, that was another issue. But, and again, you have a lot of the mainstream groups, the mainstream advocacy groups will put out calls for, detention should be nicer, we shouldn't move people as far from their families, and that's ridiculous, let's just get rid of it, there's just no reason for it to exist. So, I understand they have their, they have their role that they play in being moderates or whatever, but I think it's something like detention, there shouldn't be that difficult to get unity around calling for an end to detention.
I think one of the things that I learned from your book too was that, if you aren't a citizen, you aren't entitled to any sort of legal representation in court. And so, if a lot of people assume that when you go to trial that you have someone on your side and that's something that we guarantee for everybody, but it's not, it's something that's frequently, consistently denied to immigrants in our courts.
Right, I mean, it's guaranteed if you are charged criminally. So if you have a criminal charge, regardless of your status, then, and you're going in to face a criminal charge in a regular court, then you have the right to a lawyer. But if you're in immigration court, which isn't even really a court, it's not part of the judicial system, it's part of the executive branch. So you're not even really in the judicial system, it's an administrative proceeding, and you don't have a right to anything. So you just, it's just administrative.
Just on that point, I know at some point the Solidarity Committee went and represented somebody who's picked up an undocumented worker, and because they were able to verify that this individual was under 18, they didn't get slammed with a felony for having false documentation, so he was able to come back eventually to the United States. So if you don't have the representation, they can book you for a felony, and you might not be able to translate that you're not eligible for that felony because of your age, for instance. The other thing I just wanted to point out, sort of on the Bracero program of allowing workers to come in here, what struck me in reading about the history of the farm workers and Cesar Chavez was he actually organized people, I think it was Salinas, who didn't want these field jobs because they were so low paying, to march on the Labor Department and demand that they be hired for the jobs so that he could get more of the local people the jobs in the fields, and have people to establish the union for building up the standards. This got him some criticism from the groups of people who wanted to protect the Braceros program, both the immigrants who were coming up for it as well as the bosses. But I thought that was an innovative tactic to take back the work. Most of the people who did it were Filipinos or Mexican Americans who lived in the ghetto, but that was an interesting point that he challenged the system on that basis.
I just remembered that I forgot to say another thing in talking about this, that several of these, definitely the ACLU one, and I don't remember if any of the others brought up that an end to local police collaboration with immigration as a major point, a major demand, and also an end to the criminal prosecution of people for entering the country. There was also, I don't remember which one this had, but there was one of them, or maybe a different thing I saw, was saying that we need an amnesty for people who have been charged with a criminal offense for coming into the country, so that they need to be allowed to not have that be have that be wiped off their record. So I thought that was also a really interesting demand to bring up, and a useful demand to bring up, because this has been this huge, all these Operation Streamline and all these things that they've done in the border states, where they're basically every person caught entering the U.S. is criminally charged, even though it's a misdemeanor, but they're criminally charged with entering country. So then they're clogging up the actual federal courts. These are the real courts, not the administrative courts. They're clogging up the courts with these criminal cases, and you know, and then people are pleading guilty and whatever, and then they've got this on their record, and then they're barred from ever re-entering. So that's another thing that was raised as a problem to look at. I'm pretty sure that the ACLU raised that on one level. I don't remember if they weren't the ones calling for the amnesty, but I don't remember where I read that.
Okay.
Announcement?
Yeah.
Next forum is on March 15th with John Hall, who's a director of composition at Bard College on music, protest, and politics. And then on April 8th, Fred Magdoff on the environment. And then in May 10th, Jeff Perry on the making of the white race, a book by Theodore Allen. So those are the forums that are coming up.
May 10th?
May 10th. Right. If you're not on the email list, it's over there. And Jane's book is over there. There's copies available. Oh, and there's a silent auction for a picture if anybody would be interested in that.
Well, thank you so much for hosting, and thank you so much, Jane, for coming to speak.
Thank you.
Thank you.